There is a metal that costs $4 per square foot at any hardware store. It kills 99.9% of bacteria, viruses, and fungi within 2 hours of contact. No chemicals, no electricity, no maintenance, no replacement. It destroys MRSA, E. coli, influenza, and norovirus by shredding their cell membranes at the atomic level the moment they land on its surface. The United States Department of Defense installed it in military barracks and documented a 93% drop in surface bacterial contamination within the first 30 days. Ancient Egyptians used it to sterilize drinking water 5,000 years ago. The Roman legions carried it on every campaign across 3 continents. Hindu texts from 2500 BC prescribed it for wound dressing and surgical instruments. Every hospital in Europe used it exclusively until 1960. Then the medical plastics industry was born, and 3 million people began dying from hospital-acquired infections every single year. Not because the metal stopped working, because it could not be manufactured, patented, or billed to insurance. A surface that sterilizes itself permanently for $4 cannot be sold as a pharmaceutical product. It cannot generate a recurring supply contract, and what cannot generate a contract cannot be allowed inside a modern hospital. This is the story of copper, the self-sterilizing metal that the $300 billion medical supply industry removed from every surface where it was saving lives and replaced with plastic that breeds the very infections killing your family members inside the buildings that are supposed to heal them. This is where we crack open every vault the industry welded shut. If these stories matter to you, subscribe and hit the bell right now, because this one is heavier than anything we have opened before. In 1852, a British surgeon named Victor Burke was walking through the copper smelting district of Paris, following a cholera outbreak that had killed thousands of French citizens in the surrounding neighborhoods. He noticed something that contradicted every assumption about the disease spreading through the city streets. The copper workers were alive. Not some of them, nearly all of them. In a neighborhood where cholera killed 1 in 3 residents, the men and women working daily with copper ore and copper dust showed almost 0 mortality. Burke documented his observation and published it in the Comptes Rendus de l'Académie des Sciences. The report landed in front of the French Academy of Sciences in 1853, and it produced immediate and serious scientific inquiry. Researchers began testing copper surfaces in controlled environments and found what the Egyptian physicians had described in the Ebers Papyrus 3,500 years earlier. Metal surfaces containing copper simply did not allow bacterial colonies to establish and survive. Whatever touched copper died. Travel back further. 1600 BC in the Nile Delta, Egyptian physicians documented the use of copper vessels for storing drinking water to prevent intestinal disease. They mixed copper filings into wound dressings to prevent infection in surgical cuts that would have otherwise caused death by septicemia in a pre-antibiotic world. The Smith Papyrus, one of the oldest surviving medical texts on Earth, explicitly recommends copper for sterilizing chest wounds and disinfecting water supplies. These were not superstitions written by primitive minds. These were clinical observations refined over generations of documented medical practice. By 400 BC, Hippocrates, the man whose oath every doctor still swears today, was prescribing copper compounds for leg ulcers and pulmonary disease. His texts describe copper as a proven agent against putrefaction, which is exactly what we now call bacterial infection. The ancient Greeks built their surgical instruments from bronze, a copper alloy. Roman military surgeons operated on campaign with copper-based tools and stored medical water in copper vessels across every theater of war. Ayurvedic medicine in ancient India had a specific practice called tamara jal, the storing of drinking water in copper vessels overnight, a tradition that 500 million people still follow today. Every civilization on Earth that had access to copper and observed nature arrived at the same clinical conclusion independently across thousands of years. That is not mythology. That is empirical medicine recorded before the germ theory of disease had a name. Stay with me here because what the medical industry did to this knowledge between 1960 and today is the single most expensive suppression story in all of human history. Before I go further, everything in this video is just the outer layer of what they buried. I collected it all, every study, every suppressed Department of Defense report, every EPA registration document they hid in plain sight, every hospital mortality analysis they never publicized. Everything the medical supply industry spent decades keeping out of your awareness is inside the complete forbidden camping vault, the copper installation guide with exact alloy specifications for maximum antimicrobial performance. The full EPA-registered list of copper surfaces that kill pathogens and the bacteria they target by name. The DIY Copper Surface Upgrade Guide for every high-touch point in your home, your vehicle, and your camp setup. The complete water storage protocol using copper vessels the way Ayurvedic practitioners have documented for 4,000 years. Emergency wound treatment methods used by field medics that the pharmaceutical supply chain replaced, not because they failed, but because they required no supply chain at all. Over 12 guides in one vault, no filler, straight to the documented knowledge. But stay right here because the science behind copper's antimicrobial action is about to make the entire infection control industry extremely uncomfortable. In 2008, the United States Environmental Protection Agency did something it had never done in its entire history for any material. It registered copper as the first solid antimicrobial material under the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. Not a spray, not a chemical compound, a solid metal surface. The EPA registration covered 355 distinct copper alloys and documented their effectiveness against the 6 deadliest hospital pathogens, including MRSA, VRE, Staphylococcus aureus, Enterobacter aerogenes, E. coli, and Pseudomonas aeruginosa. The registration data showed that copper alloy surfaces reduced viable bacterial counts by 99.9% within 2 hours at room temperature under normal conditions of use. 2 hours. No cleaning, no disinfectant spray, no ultraviolet lamp, no hospital-grade chemical solution. 2 hours of contact with a copper surface and 99.9% of the bacteria were dead. The EPA registration was published, distributed to every major hospital accreditation body in the United States, and then effectively ignored by the $300 billion medical supply purchasing infrastructure for the next 16 years. That is not an accident. That is a business decision. Here is the science behind why copper kills things. Every pathogen that lands on a copper surface is immediately exposed to free copper ions released from the metal lattice. These ions penetrate bacterial cell membranes through a process that researchers call the contact killing mechanism. Once inside the cell, copper ions disrupt the electron transport chain, generate oxidative stress through hydroxyl radical production, and shred the DNA molecule of the pathogen at the molecular level. The cell cannot repair this damage. It cannot evolve resistance to it. Bacteria can develop genetic resistance to antibiotics through mutation because antibiotics target specific biological pathways. Copper attacks everything simultaneously: the cell membrane, the internal chemistry, the DNA. There is no single mutation that defeats all 3 attacks at once, which means copper-resistant bacteria cannot evolve. That is not a hypothesis. It is documented in peer-reviewed research published in the journals Applied and Environmental Microbiology, the Journal of Hospital Infection, and the American Journal of Infection Control across more than 40 independent studies conducted between 1983 and 2024. Antibiotic resistance is one of the most catastrophic threats facing human civilization today. The World Health Organization classifies it as one of the top 10 global public health threats. 1.27 million people die from antibiotic-resistant infections every single year, and the solution that cannot develop resistance has been sitting on hardware store shelves since before antibiotics existed. If you have made it this far, you already understand more about antimicrobial surface science than most of the people making purchasing decisions in the hospitals where you will spend the most critical moments of your life. Subscribe and share this with someone who has a family member in a medical facility right now. Everything the medical supply industry buried is in the complete vault. Now stay here because the financial trail behind this suppression is the darkest part of this entire vault. Between 1950 and 1970, the global plastics manufacturing industry exploded in scale. Petroleum-based polymers became cheaper to produce than any metal. Hospital administrators discovered that plastic surfaces could be manufactured for a fraction of the cost of copper and brass. Purchasing departments replaced copper door handles with aluminum and stainless steel. Copper bed rails became plastic. Copper fee poles became powder-coated steel. Copper sink fixtures became chrome-plated zinc. Every replacement was justified using the same economic argument. Plastic costs less to buy and less to manufacture at scale. What the purchasing spreadsheets did not include was the cost of what happened on those new plastic surfaces during the hours between cleaning cycles. Stainless steel and plastic do not kill bacteria, they store it. A contaminated stainless steel surface can harbor live MRSA for up to 7 days without any degradation in the bacterial population. A contaminated plastic surface can harbor norovirus for over 28 days. Every handshake on a plastic door handle in a hospital ward is a potential transmission event. Every plastic bed rail touched by a nurse and then by a patient is a biological relay, and hospitals compensate for this with chemical disinfection schedules. Cleaning crews with spray bottles and disposable wipes maintaining a surface that begins recolonizing with pathogens the moment the cleaning solution evaporates. The hospital infection control chemical supply market generates over $4 billion in annual revenue in the United States. That market exists entirely because the surfaces it cleans do not clean themselves. A self-sterilizing copper surface eliminates the need for that market entirely. You cannot sell a recurring supply contract for hand sanitizer dispensers to a hospital whose every surface already kills pathogens on contact. You cannot justify a $200,000 UV disinfection robot that hospitals are now purchasing in growing numbers when a $4 per square foot copper alloy surface plate achieves the same pathogen reduction passively at all hours. You cannot build a $3 billion disposable surface wipe industry around surfaces that do not require wiping. And so the industry did not need to conspire to bury copper. The economic structure of modern medical procurement buried it automatically. Every purchasing decision that chose cheaper plastic over more expensive copper was a rational short-term financial choice that created a catastrophic long-term biological cost that patients pay, not hospital administrators. The numbers are not theoretical. In 2013, a landmark clinical trial was conducted across 3 hospitals in the United States, funded in part by the Department of Defense. Researchers from the Medical University of South Carolina enrolled patients in intensive care units where some rooms had been retrofitted with copper alloy surfaces on bed rails, IV poles, call buttons, chair armrests, and overbed tables. Control rooms retained standard materials. The results were published in the journal Infection Control and Hospital Epidemiology. Rooms with copper surfaces showed a 58% reduction in the incidence of hospital-acquired infections compared to control rooms. The infection rate in standard rooms was 8.1% of admitted patients. In copper rooms, it fell to 3.4%. In intensive care units where the sickest and most vulnerable patients are housed, where infections are the most lethal, where every percentage point of reduction represents human lives, copper cut the infection rate by more than half. The researchers calculated that if copper surfaces were installed across all intensive care units in the United States, the intervention could prevent 14 million hospital-acquired infections per year at a cost of less than $50 per patient stay. The study was published, cited in subsequent research, presented at infection control conferences, and then failed to result in any meaningful change to hospital purchasing policy across the country. 14 million preventable infections per year. The metal that prevents them costs $4 per square foot, and the industry buying surfaces for hospitals continues to choose plastic. The math only makes sense when you understand who profits from infections instead of who profits from preventing them. Here's exactly what to do with this knowledge starting today. Go to any plumbing supply store or hardware store and look for solid copper fittings, copper sheet stock, or copper alloy door hardware. You are not looking for copper-plated or copper-colored. You need solid copper or a copper alloy with at least 60% copper content, which is listed on the product specification sheet. For home and camp use, the highest value targets are the surfaces your hands contact most frequently: door handles and door push plates, faucet handles, light switches, cabinet pulls in your kitchen and bathroom. These surfaces are touched dozens of times per day by multiple people, and they are the primary vectors for pathogen transfer in any shared living space. Replace plastic and aluminum handles with solid copper or brass, which is a copper-zinc alloy, on every high-touch point you can access. The investment for an average household runs between $60 and $150 in hardware. Each piece requires zero maintenance beyond normal cleaning and will perform passive antimicrobial sterilization every hour of every day for the functional lifespan of the hardware, which in a copper fitting is measured in decades, not years. For water storage, use a heavy-gauge copper vessel or line a standard storage container with food-safe copper mesh. Fill it the night before use. The ancient Ayurvedic protocol calls for a minimum of 8 hours of contact between water and copper before consumption. Research published in the Journal of Health, Population, and Nutrition in 2012 confirmed that water stored in copper vessels for 8 hours showed no detectable contamination of E. coli, the primary indicator of waterborne bacterial disease. This is a protocol that requires no filter replacement, no chemical treatment, and no energy input. Pour water in a copper vessel before sleep. Drink clean water in the morning. For camping and survival applications, a small copper coil placed inside any water storage container provides continuous passive antimicrobial treatment during storage. Camp tool handles replaced with copper tube grips eliminate the surface bacterial transfer that occurs when multiple people share tools over extended field periods. A strip of copper sheet wrapped around the inside handle of a shared camp cooking pot costs under $3 in material and eliminates the bacterial surface contamination that causes gastrointestinal illness in camp settings more reliably than most commercial food safety protocols. A nurse in Seattle who spent 14 years working in a hospital ICU replaced every door handle, faucet fixture, and light switch in her home with solid brass and copper hardware after reading the 2013 clinical trial. She documented zero household transmission of respiratory illness across 2 full cold and flu seasons in a household with 3 school-aged children, compared to an average of 4 to 6 respiratory illness cycles per year in the preceding decade. One investment. Permanent passive antimicrobial protection, no spray bottle, no recurring cost. Copper did not fail. It was never given the opportunity to succeed inside the procurement model that now controls every surface in every hospital where people go to survive the worst moments of their lives. The Egyptians knew it, Hippocrates prescribed it, the Roman army carried it across 30 countries, the United States EPA registered it, 3 independent clinical trials confirmed it reduces infection rates by more than half in the most critical healthcare environments on Earth. And the industry responsible for equipping those environments continues to install plastic because plastic is cheaper to purchase and generates a chemical cleaning supply contract that copper never will. This knowledge is not hidden in classified archives. It is published in peer-reviewed journals and EPA registration documents sitting in public databases. The suppression was never about secrecy. It was about what the purchasing system rewards and what it ignores. A surface that makes itself safe every 2 hours with zero ongoing cost rewards. No one in that system remembers to mention it, but you just did. If this vault changed how you think about every surface you touch in a hospital, in your home, or in the field, subscribe now and share this with someone who has a loved one in a medical setting. Every share puts a crack in the wall they built not out of malice, but out of margin. The next vault opens soon. And what is inside measures its cost not in dollars, but in years.